Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on what for me is a very cold night. Well, you just exercised. So. I'm really thrilled to be able to share my passion for Dory Manor's life's work so far and for his poetry and academic pursuits. And very grateful that we were able to bring him here. I hope this is just the beginning of a much longer engagement. Dory Manor was born in Tel Aviv in 1971, so I'm still in the beans about your age. I think he is the most important Hebrew poet of his generation, as well as a master translator and editor. He has published 4 collections of poetry so far: Minority, 2001, The Alpha and the Omega, a libretto co-authored with Anna Herman for an opera based on a series of lithographs by Edvard Munch in 2001, and Baritone, 2005. A volume of his collected poetic works, The Center of the Flesh, edited by scholar Dan Miron, was published in 2012, and his new collection, Hebrew and You, Ivrit Ve'ata, is forthcoming later this year. If you ask very nicely, he may read us some of those amazing new poems which he shared with us on Friday. Manor is the founder and editor of the prestigious and really groundbreaking literary magazine Ho, which he insists is not a literary group, but I beg to differ. I think it has done a lot over the past 23 years to return poetry to its central place in Hebrew culture, renewing the traditional links which both Eastern European and Middle Eastern cultures have always cherished between poetry, music, and performance. And if you hear him or Anna Herman or Sivan Beskin read, you will see those links, as well as if you look up, I guess, on YouTube, the amazing radio program that he launched years ago and went for several years with 2 of the Canaan sisters, Rona and then Shlom Zion, Tzipurei Laila Mitpaitot. I would translate it as something like poeticizing night owls, or night owls poeticizing. You'd see the connection, right, between those 3, music, performance, and poetry. His poetry, and that of the group he leads, combines an emphasis on rigorous form, rhythm, and rhyme, and sexually and politically radical thematics, to develop a queer minoritarian poetics that insists on the autonomy of verbal art, even as it provides a forceful negative in the Adornian kind of photography sense, those of you who still remember what a negative looks like. So a negative of the abuses of language by politicians and corporations. His work restores with virtuoso mastery and secularizes liturgical genres like the piyut, as well as the Italian Hebrew traditions, such as the sonnet and macaronic poetry, which is 2 homophonic, sounding the same, poems, the same sounds generating a Hebrew poem, one in the tradition of the lament, the kinah, and written in biblical Hebrew. The other, a French poem with the same sounds, but totally different meaning, in the style of Apollinaire, each providing a different meditation on love and death, forming a unison chorale. So maybe he knows all this stuff by heart, so he may recite it later on if you ask him. In 2017, Dory got his PhD in translation studies and comparative literature from INALCO University of Paris, The dissertation was on translations of French poetry into modern Hebrew, and I think it's a very important piece of scholarship on the importance, but also the pitfalls of constructing a national canon via translation. And he shows the differences between the various trends, the various periods in that. And spent 10 years really in Paris teaching Hebrew literature and translation at INALCO and at the Institut National de Sciences Politiques. His Hebrew translations of classic literature include works by authors such as Voltaire, Descartes, Molière, Flaubert, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Valéry, Apollinaire, but also Ginsberg, Blake, Lorca, Auden, and others. In 2015, Manor co-edited with Ronen Sonis Nifla'ata, the first Hebrew language anthology of LGBT poetry, including texts going from ancient Greek and Sumerian poetry to contemporary Israeli verse. Manor was the recipient of several literary awards, among which the Prime Minister's Prize for Hebrew Writers, 2007, the Chernyakhovsky Prize for Translation of World Masterpieces for his translation of Voltaire's Candide, 2008, the Ministry of Cultural Biennial Prize for the Best Literary Editor in 2011, and last but not least, and very close to my heart, the prestigious Yehuda Amichai Prize for his own poetry in 2015. He's an honorary fellow in writing by the University of Iowa here in the US. As part of his commitment to the multilingual, formally rigorous tradition of Jewish poetry, his work maintains a nuanced dialogue with Yiddish modernism, especially the work of Binyamin Harshav, the published poet Hey Binyamin, and the extraordinary oeuvre of Avrom Sutzkever. This is the topic of his talk today, Souls Wrapped in Sandpaper, Avrom Sutzkever and the Mother Tongues, plural, of Hebrew. If you ask nicely, we may also hear some of the old and new poems afterwards. Okay. Dr. Dory Manor.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm very thrilled and excited to be here. And I would like, first of all, to extend my gratitude to you, Hannah Kronfeld, and the staff of the Center for Jewish Studies here in Berkeley for inviting me today. And to all of you who've come from near and far, it's a true honor for me to be here, surrounded by so many people that I love and I admire for years. I'm truly grateful. I left Israel at the age of 20 and a bit, and only then did I realize how the fact of Hebrew as my mother tongue influenced every facet of my life. This was true on the street and in daily life. It was true when confronting bureaucracy, and it was true at work and in school, in friendship and in love. But the question of my writing language as a young Hebrew poet living in a French-speaking environment was far more tangled. Would I continue writing solely in Hebrew? Might I write poetry in French? Can one even write poetry in a tongue that is not one's mother tongue? And does it make sense to carry on writing poetry in a language with no local readership, surrounded by people who cannot read so much as a single word you've written? These ruminations were very much on my mind during my first years in Paris, the city in which I dreamed up spending 10 long years. I was not worried about the welfare of my Hebrew. On the contrary, I soon realized that my Hebrew was well served by this temporary incubation. In other words, I was glad that my Hebrew was given the opportunity to exist in an environment apart from the press and digital media, the commercials and the jingles, the quotidian language of the street. Instead, I could nourish it only with the words I actively sought out, the language of conversation and correspondence, the language of the books I was reading. I suppose that if I were a prose writer, the long-term separation would have been problematic. But since I write poetry, I mostly noticed the inherent advantages of my self-imposed exile. Living far from the land of common Hebrew, I viewed writing poetry in that language as a private test case, or perhaps better yet, a vaccine, in which poetry serves as a language within a language. I took poetry to be a lingual art form that strives to sift through the random heaps of daily language, discarding the scrap and assembling a new transcendent experience, in which language is the means and also the end. I felt that distance from Hebrew would help me explore the language from the outside, and therefore, perhaps paradoxically, enhance my ability to write in that language. In short, a few months into my stay in Paris, it became clear to me I would write poetry only in Hebrew, even while living abroad. This may have been an overly radical decision, and in retrospect, a somewhat mistaken one. But it was not an unusual one. It is the rare case for a modern poet, as opposed to fiction authors and playwrights, to forgo his mother tongue and turn, for the purpose of poetry, to a new language. The act of clinging to a mother tongue is somehow tied to the soul of poetry, something at the root of the deep and mysterious bond between it and language, starkly differentiating it from other genres. I say clinging to the mother tongue because that's just the way it is. The poet is always nursing at the breast of language. The language in which a person writes poetry is the language in which he discovered the taste of lemon and honey. The language in which he first spoke his name and first heard his mother sing a lullaby. The language in which he first called out to his father, and the language in which he felt the first burn of fraternal jealousy. The language in which he felt the impact of a fist on the street. His voice clenched in a tight juvenile scream, an alto cry amid the scuffle. Why does poetry preserve these ancient memories over others? Maybe on account of the mystic nature of the lyrical words and the cryptic connection between the poetry a mature person writes and the soothing mantras of his childhood. For lyrical poetry is but the development later in life of an old abjuration, an old mantra. As someone entrusted with the usage of modern Hebrew, a language that many of Hebrew's most wonderful poets used, though it was not their mother tongue, I must cast doubt on the emphatic statement made by Paul Celan. Only, and I quote, only in the mother tongue can one speak one's own truth. And yet, in my own private experience, as someone who lived for many long years in a foreign land, someone who chose not to use its language for poetry, I identify with that statement with all my heart. I could buy une tomate at my old grocer at the Daguerre market and chop it up finely for salad. But there's no tomate in the world that will ever make me feel the prickle of the red sourness across my gums as it does when I sound out the tones of that word in Hebrew, a word that is familiar down to the deep glens of my youth, agvania. Agvania. I want to underscore, I'm talking about poetry. Writing fiction or plays or essays is a different story entirely. Most authors, playwrights, and essayists use their mother tongue, of course, but there are plenty of examples of writers who made the switch from one language to another, from Joseph Conrad to Nabokov, to Beckett, to in our day Alexander Hemon and Andreas Siman, and the list is long. The same cannot be said of poetry. It's hard to think of a single Conrad or Nabokov of poetry. Outside the realm of Hebrew, I have a hard time coming up with a single example of a modern major poet who wrote in a language that was not his or her mother tongue, Even the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, who after being forced from Russia, settled in the US and wrote marvelous essays in English, rarely used his adopted language for verse, and rightly not. His English language poetry cannot hold a candle to his Russian poetry. When asked after winning the 1987 Nobel Prize for Literature if he identified as a Russian or an American, Brodsky said, "I'm a Jew, a poet in Russian, an essayist in English." The Jewishness of poetry is a rather common refrain. All poets are Jews, Marina Tsvetaeva once wrote, using Judaism as a metaphor for persecuted minorities everywhere. But there is also no shortage of immediate and non-metaphoric Jews among the ranks of modern poets. Poetic translingualism, though, is genuinely rare. When I was in Paris and still contemplating what language to write in, I looked for uplifting examples that I could cling to, role models that could guide me. In other words, I sought foreign poets who, at last temporarily, had set aside their mother tongues and started writing poetry in French. The more I looked, the more I realized how uncommon it was. Indeed, it was nearly non-existent. A fact made all the more surprising considering that Paris was, as Walter Benjamin put it, the capital of the 19th century. A central destination for exiles and immigrants and the site of many a poet's cultural crusade. Foreign poets flocked to Paris and resided there for long periods of time. On occasion, they settled there forever. Among them were those with a solid command of French. And it would follow that some of them, like the many authors who called Paris their home, would make the switch to the Gallic tongue. Most fascinating of all is the case of Paul Celan, a Jewish poet born in 1920. His original name was Paul Pesach Anchel. The plain name Celan is a reshuffling of his family name. It was from Czernowitz in Bukovina, a German-speaking region that was made part of Romania after the First World War. His primary language as a child was German. Though he learned Hebrew in his youth, his Zionist father sent him to the Jewish school Safa Ivriya. In Celan's own unique circumstances, the choice of German as his sole language of poetic expression was hardly to be taken for granted. Not only had he been raised on 3 or 4 other languages, and not only had he never lived within the boundaries of Germany, but the language that he chose to continue writing in after the war was the language used by his torturers, the murderers of his family. Perhaps for that reason, Celan made the matter of writing in the language of one's youth an inflexible ideology. As mentioned, it was he who said that a poet who writes in a language other than his mother tongue is lying. It was an answer he gave when, after the war, he was urged to write in Romanian rather than German. A hypothetical rumination. What would have happened if, in 1948, Celan had chosen Israel rather than France as his home? Would he have written poetry in Hebrew, or would he have clung exclusively to German in Israel too? It's compelling to compare Celan's case with that of another poet, also a native of Bukovina, Dan Pagis, who was born in 1930 in Radauts, some 60 kilometers from Czernowitz, Celan's birthplace. Pagis was also raised in German, and he too spoke several languages in his youth. Romanian first and foremost, the national language, but also Yiddish and Russian. Unlike Celan, he had no formal Hebrew education as a child and hardly knew the language at all when he settled in pre-state Israel after the war. Like Celan, he was jailed during the war and committed to forced labor. He too experienced the horrors of the Shoah firsthand, and saw with his own eyes the deaths of many of his neighbors and family members. In Pagis' poetry, much like Celan's, the Shoah casts a dark shadow. And there have been plenty of comparisons between Pagis, written in pencil in the sealed railway, כתוב בעיפרון בקרון חתום, and Celan's Psalm and Death Fugue. Yet Pagis, as opposed to Celan, who was 10 years his senior, did not write in his mother tongue, but rather in a language he acquired later in life, Hebrew. And in contrast to Celan's proclamation, Pagis quite assuredly did not lie in his lyricism. That said, there can be no doubt that Pagis' decision to write poetry in a language that he acquired only at the age of 16, by which time he spoke and wrote in 3 or 4 other languages, had a far-reaching impact on his Hebrew poetry. But are these influences not the birthright of all modern Hebrew poetry? For in Hebrew, as opposed to all other modern languages, the move from language to language, nearly always in one direction, from the poet's mother tongue to Hebrew, is quite common. When I take a modern anthology of poetry from off the shelf, English, German, Spanish, French, Italian, Russian, and flip through the bios of the poets at the back of each volume, I find that of all the poets I've ever heard of or in any way encountered, I can't find a single one who wrote in a language that was acquired later in life. In contrast, in Hebrew, up until a generation or two ago, this was the norm. Nearly all the Hebrew poets, starting from the birth of modern Hebrew poetry in modern Hebrew in the last decade of the 19th century, and continuing on to those who started publishing poetry in the 1970s, wrote verse in a language that was not their first and occasionally not their second or third language. I've stopped in the 1970s because afterward there was an essential shift, and to my delight, it included a change in the ethnic background of Israel's poets, who were no longer only from Eastern and Central Europe, but also from North Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. It's worth noting that even the first Sabra poet, Esther Rab, who was born in Petach Tikva in 1894, grew up with Yiddish in her parents' and grandparents' home. She was taught Hebrew, though, from a very young age. During the early years of the modern Hebrew Renaissance, the mother tongue of most Hebrew poets was Yiddish, and in some cases Russian or some other Eastern European language. Later, German joined the mix, and later still, albeit more rarely, English and Arabic. There is nothing new in noting these facts. The effects of foreign poetry on the body of Hebrew poetry is a subject that has been researched at length. And it is well known that many Hebrew poets arrived at the shores of Hebrew from afar. Acquaintance and familiarity aside, though, it seems we have neglected a more essential and general element: the dramatic singularity of this situation when considered from the point of view of poetry. If for a moment we leaf through the history of 20th century Hebrew poetry, we'll find fascinating cases that have no likeness in other modern poetic cultures. Rachel Blufstein, one of the national poets of modern Hebrew, one of the most distinct products of the second Aliyah, a pivotal wave of immigration to pre-state Israel, did not know, at least so the story goes, a single word of Hebrew at the time of her arrival at the port of Jaffa in 1909, at the age of 18. Not one word of a language that she would yet master to the extent that she would become 2 decades later one of Hebrew's central and most beloved poets. Whether this story is factual or a slight alteration of reality, for in the interest of historical accuracy, it should be noted that she had learned a bit of Hebrew as a child. It is nonetheless clear that, as opposed to many of the men who arrived during that same period, Rachel, who like them shared a Zionist socialist ideology, had no yeshiva background. She had never studied biblical or Mishnaic Hebrew, nor did she have any grasp of the spoken language when she settled in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Does this in any way detract from the delicate and tragic beauty of Rachel's poetry? Of course not. Does this fact affect her linguistic choices, the nature of her writing, the style, cadences, and forms? Without a doubt. Reading and researching Rachel's poetry without addressing this rare lingual biographical element would mean missing not only a central component of the poet's cultural milieu, but also an element rooted in the heart of her work. For when Rachel wrote Hebrew poetry under the influence of the young Anna Akhmatova, for example, her cultural and poetic sense of belonging was fundamentally Slavic. Even as she wrote in Hebrew, she was in many ways operating from within Russian culture. Her sphere of poetic reference was Russian in terms of ethos, the role of the poet and poetry in society, and thematically, stylistically, structurally, tonally, and prosodically. In essence, Rachel took the poetic sensibility that she had formed in Russian and imported it, as is, to her new and still forming culture. In her adopted language, she preserved the linear logic of the poetry she knew in her first language. And in that way, she operated not only as a Hebrew poet and not only as a Russian woman who shifted her writing tongue to Hebrew, but above all else, and the precise definition here is of great importance, as a Russian poet writing in Hebrew. If we consider for a moment the overwhelming readership of Hebrew poetry of Rachel's generation, we find that the vast majority of the audience did just as she did. In their new language, they duplicated the traditions and innovations of the poetry they knew in the languages of the youth, a body of work that they continued to read even as they became concurrently readers of Hebrew poetry. So it was during the generation before Rachel, and so it was during the following generations. In other words, up until the historical moment when the majority of Hebrew readers were native to Hebrew and no longer knew other languages with the intimacy of a mother tongue or a language of their youth. Let's skip forward a generation to another Hebrew poet, no less central or beloved than Rachel, Leah Goldberg. Goldberg was born in 1911 to Russian-speaking parents in Königsberg and grew up in Kovno, in Kaunas, in Lithuania. Her mother tongue was Russian, but she had a strong grasp of German from a very early age. On the streets of Kovno, she heard Yiddish and Lithuanian, languages she knew, but not proficiently. She arrived late to the language that would be the language of her poetic expression. Only when studying at the gymnasia in Kovno did she learn Hebrew. It was her fifth language. In 1932, just a decade after learning Hebrew, Goldberg published in a local journal called Petach her first poems. 3 years later, they were included in her debut collection, Tabaot Ashan, Smoke Rings. It is an incredible thing to behold. This young woman, in the span of 10 years, went from learning the Hebrew alphabet to penning glowing Hebrew verse. Yet another case that likely has scant equivalent in modern poetry. The canonic and central poet wrote almost or all of her poetry, not in her mother tongue and not in her second or third language, but in a language that she acquired at age 10 with no prior background. This linguistic predicament is easily explained by the history of modern Jewry at large and the annals of Eastern European Jewry specifically, of course, but that would be too easy. At this moment in time, I'm interested in an entirely different point of view, that of poetry. Goldberg never fully abandoned Russian, the language in which she wrote her first poems, nor her second language, German. In her youth, she lived in Germany for several years and even wrote her doctorate in that language. Some of her best friends in Israel were German or Russian speakers, and when conversing with her mother, alongside whom she lived all her life, she did so until her final day in Russian. She also prolifically translated prose and poetry from those two languages, her primary reading languages, and later added other source languages, French, English, Italian, and more. Listening to a recording of Leah Goldberg, it is immediately clear to what extent her Hebrew, however rich and beautiful, was always an acquired tongue. Not just a diction and the heavy Russian accent. Her manner of expression and word choice make it starkly clear that she never had the sensuous immediacy with Hebrew, the effortlessly available sub-epidermal flow that characterizes a native tongue was just absent. Any native Hebrew speaker can note this without difficulty. Does this in any way tarnish the great beauty of her Hebrew poetry? Of course not. It is a fact that ought to be noted and considered when researching or reading her work, without a doubt. Goldberg, like Rachel before her, could be considered by most parameters a Russian poet writing in Hebrew. She too was deeply influenced by Akhmatova and later by symbolist poetry. writing poetry in Hebrew under the influence of poets writing in the languages of her youth. She was in actuality advancing the dialectical development of modern Russian and German poetry in Hebrew. Of course, she was operating within a Hebrew framework, and the neo-symbolist style she adopted in the 40s and 50s owed much to the Hebrew influences of Avraham Shlonsky and Natan Alterman. Yet Shlonsky and Alterman themselves, though they learned Hebrew at an earlier age than their colleague from Kovno, are also poets that are firmly within the Slavic poetic tradition. The domain of their poetic notions is principally Russian, in terms of ethos, poetic technique, and the specific character of modernist poetry in which they are operating. Not long ago, I watched a TV interview with Shlonsky. It was filmed in 1968, some 5 years before his death at age 73. And though I was familiar with his biography, and though I knew that for him Yiddish and Russian preceded Hebrew, I was nonetheless shocked to see and hear him. The strong accent, the cumbersome diction, the foreign intonation, even the body language, and the twitching, and the mane of hair. Could there be something akin to this in French, Italian, English? Hard to imagine. What I saw before me was a Slavic poet operating in Hebrew. During the following generation, the statehood generation, Dor Medina, the unusual situation endured. Yehuda Amichai, for example, was born in Würzburg in 1924. His name in his youth was Ludwig Pfeiffer, and his first language was German. He began studying Hebrew at age 11. His peer Natan Zach, originally Harry Zeitelbach, was born in 1930 in Berlin. He came to pre-states Israel at age 6. Hebrew was his third language. After German, his father's language, and Italian, his mother's language. To this very day, Zach speaks Hebrew with a nurtured and distinct German accent, a lovely accent that reminds me always of my father's family. But when I told friends in Paris that one of the central poets of modern-day Hebrew speaks his own language with a heavy foreign accent and a diction that is German, they were shocked. Could a leading French poet speak French with a thick German accent? They could entertain no such notion. It may be interesting to note the reverse of this cultural linguistic phenomena. For instance, the Jung Israel group, which was founded in 1951 by poets who came to Israel after the Holocaust and chose to carry on writing poetry in Yiddish. One member of the group was the young Binyamin Herushovsky, later Harshav, who at roughly the same time helped launch the journal Likrat, the locomotive that would pull the train of statehood generation Hebrew poetry. The unrivaled leader of Jung Israel was Avrom Sutzkever, one of the greatest poets to have worked in this land in any language. Sutzkever, born in Smogon, Lithuania, moved to Tel Aviv in 1947 and lived there till his death in 2010. For more than 60 years then, he lived in a city that spoke Hebrew, a language he knew from childhood and in which he wrote his first poems as a child and teen. He was also friends with many Hebrew poets, with whom he often spoke Yiddish, the language of their shared youth. And yet he never made the transition to writing in Hebrew. He was well aware of the repercussions of choosing to cling to Yiddish as his creative tool. He saw the thinning of the ranks in the readership of Yiddish poetry after the war, thinned almost to the point of extinction. And he knew that the language of the diaspora was unpopular, to put it mildly, among his new countrymen. It was clear to him that his choice of language sentenced him to eternal seclusion from the readers of poetry in the land in which he lived. On countless occasions, Sutzkever was asked why he did not write in Hebrew. I made an eternal covenant with Yiddish, he once said. He related to modern Hebrew poetry with familiarity and a touch of amusement and even condescension, like an older sister watching with a knowing smile the first clumsy steps taken by her toddler sister. The notion of a language beneath the skin is one that I lifted from one of Sutzkever's last poems, written in Tel Aviv in December 1999, in which he says of Yiddish, "My language is beneath the skin." Defining the language of one's youth as the language beneath the skin is a more sober statement than the Celanian definition of inevitable falsehood for all who write poetry in the language other than their mother tongue. And yet, in both cases, of he who writes in the language of his mother's murderers and he who writes in the language of the murdered, neither of the two great poets, Celan and Sutzkever, are unusual on the landscape of world poetry. The decision to continue to write in the language upon which they were raised seemed natural and foretold. And yet, in Hebrew, the situation is so unusual, with so many poets immigrating to Hebrew, that it is Sutzkever who, in his adherence to the world norm, seems so unique. The Yiddish Israeli poet's decision to cling to his mother tongue while living in Tel Aviv was viewed as highly peculiar by his peers and continues to be seen by many readers of Hebrew poetry as downright bizarre. It's worth noting the cultural impact of this state of affairs is readily visible today, some 130 years after the bloom of modern Hebrew poetry. True, for decades, the share of Israeli poets who have counted Hebrew as a native tongue has been on the rise. Since the 70s and 80s, the majority of Hebrew poets have been writing in the mother tongue. The years pass and the Israeli poetry, for better and for worse, is becoming more and more normal. The first generation of poets born into Hebrew has largely passed. Chaim Guri, a year ago, Dalia Rabikovich, David Avidan, Yona Volach, or are in their 8th, 9th, and 10th decade of life. And as always, it is not enough to cast an eye toward the poets, but also the readership, which is, like the poets themselves, comprised of people whose native language is Hebrew, even if their parents spoke other languages at home, Arabic, Russian, English, etc. And this situation too is fundamentally different from what prevailed here just several dozen years ago. But the poets and the readers native to Hebrew inherited the poetic legacy of their multilingual and translingual forebears. And they, for their part, wrote Hebrew while referring dialectically, adopting and rejecting, knowingly and unknowingly absorbing influence, to the various poetic trends in the languages of their youth, even if those trends never existed within the realm of Hebrew poetry, but were simply part of their birth cultures. Therefore, a deep chasm exists between readers and writers who are native to Hebrew and readers and writers who arrived later at Hebrew poetry. A chasm that to this day remains unbridged and in many ways is simply being widened so long as Hebrew poetry continues to perceive itself as a sort of autarkic economy, a self-sufficient place that has no need for external imports. In the intro to my translation of Charles Baudelaire's book of poetry, Les Fleurs du Mal, Flowers of Evil, I depicted this chasm as a tree with no trunk. Hebrew poetry, this metaphor suggests, is a tree with deep and thick roots. Biblical verse, liturgical poems, or piyutim, the poetry of the medieval and Renaissance periods, and that of the Haskalah in the 18th and 19th century, and so on. In other words, all that was written before the dawn of modern Hebrew. That same tree has a verdant and healthy crown, thriving ever since Bialik's El HaTzipor to the Bird was published in 1891. But what this glorious old growth tree lacks is quite simply a trunk. In other words, the base of world poetry, a base that never existed within the realm of modern Hebrew poetry, was irrigated from afar and sustained by constant importing. It lacks its own movements and counter-movements, the schools and groups that delivered modern poetry across a variety of serpentine paths to the modern age. In order not to collapse, this trunkless tree supports itself on the branches of its brothers, the other trees of the forest, and those foreign corpuses that have nourished it incessantly. Even without clinging to the refuted legend of Hebrew as a dead language revived and reborn, it is clear that Hebrew underwent a very unique process. And so it is no surprise that the chronicles of its poetry are also unique. For the difference between modern Hebrew and classical Hebrew is not a shift that took hundreds of years, a natural linguistic evolution, but rather a substitution made knowingly and premeditatedly. Modern Hebrew does not relate to classical Hebrew in the way that, for instance, Sylvia Plath's English relates to Chaucer, or the way Paul Valéry's French relates to the 15th century verse of François Villon. The chronology of Hebrew poetry was logical so long as it operated within the framework of classical Hebrew. But from the moment that modern Hebrew poetry first flowered, which is to say from the very start of Bialik's first work, more or less, the internal logic that held classical Hebrew poetry together began to crack. The tree kept its roots and managed to grow a lovely green crown, but it was suspended in mid-air, trunkless. As opposed to poets and readers who arrived at Hebrew after mastering another language, the first and subsequent generations of native-born Sabras discovered world poetry by peering through the keyhole of Hebrew. They saw the world through a very small crack. And most were not even aware of the optical distortion imposed by this vantage point, nor did they notice the high partition between themselves and the world. They read a bit in English, and mostly read poetry that was translated into Hebrew or otherwise present in the world of Hebrew, often thanks to the cultural missions of the poets and authors belonging to the last generation of the diaspora or the third generation of immigration. But whatever was not translated or otherwise integrated, they knew only at best as a distant rumor, and more commonly did not know at all. It's important to note that a very large chunk of Western literature, and this is even more true of other literary traditions, was translated late, if at all. The situation endures. As stunning as it may sound, the canon of Western poetry, essays, and prose has been translated over the course of 4 or 5 generations, from the mid-19th century until World War II, more extensively into Yiddish than Hebrew. It stands to reason that this is true of other art forms as well, but in terms of poetry and prose, the linguistic arts, the divide between the Sabras and the world is more pronounced than in any other realm. And so, for instance, when Nathan Zach brought the gospel of imagism to the readership of Hebrew poetry, following in the footsteps of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and arriving fashionably late by a few decades, this school of poetry, a central school, but nonetheless one of many, was perceived among many of the au courant readers as poetry's sole modernist option. And for many years, perhaps to this very day, it is identified almost exclusively as the definition of modernism. This is the case even though Zach and his peers never translated the great works of the imagists. It sufficed for them to speak of its importance in their essays and poems. Other modernist strains, some no less central, were never translated and never introduced into Hebrew by the major agents of poetry, and were therefore inaccessible to the readers and writers native to Hebrew. But the difficulty is rooted not only in the existence or inexistence of a translation, but to a greater degree in the need for an introduction from a multilingual authority figure who can whisper into the ears of Hebrew readers and proclaim, take note, this and that are important works. And she over there was a masterful poet. Those arbiters, the translators of poetry and prose, editors of literature and other literary figures, have offered and continue to offer a prosthetic trunk to the tree of Hebrew poetry. And in fact, so long as the majority of Hebrew poets and readers were native to other languages, so long as they imported the poetic sensibilities that they knew so intimately in other languages, the dialectical continuum of development of modern Hebrew poetry and its own internal logic was maintained. Beneath the non-linear nature of modern Hebrew, a tough lining kept the stability of the weave intact. But for several decades now, the liner is no longer so strong, and the chronological weave of our poetry is in need of more and more patches. But hold on a second. I realize that I may sound as though I'm complaining. And the truth is quite the contrary. I am grateful. Already at the start of my life as a writer of poetry, at first intuitively and later more deliberately, I felt that writers of Hebrew poetry were faced with a challenge of great proportions, a challenge unrivaled in other languages. Without committing any sense of undue poetic patriotism, but rather via a simple analysis of the situation, culturally and poetically, it's clear to me that my peers and I have been offered a very rare opportunity, the chance to shape and found an entire constellation of poetic concepts that have at this point in time no real toehold in our language. We, the Hebrew poets of the 21st century, inherited a unique poetic language with a distinctive linguistic and poetic history. It is a great gift. And our role is to chart a new path, a path that will lead our beautiful and ancient language deep into the third millennium. Thank you very much. The film is called Black Honey, Dvash Shachor. It's a part of the series Haivrim, the Hebrew writers.
Take them to the beginning, or just
No, here it's fine. Thanks very much. Haivrim bebet, Ken. Haivrim bebet. And Sutzkever is one of the two poets the two authors, actually, that did not write in Hebrew, that are in this series of films. The other one is Jacqueline Kahanov.
If you were a filmmaker who wanted to do a dramatic film about somebody, a poet, let's say, but just incidentally a poet, it could be just an unusual individual, you could take Sutzkever's life and you could take it from beginning to end, and it would be the most astonishing guide to the most dramatic moments in Jewish history of the 20th century.
אני הייתי בן 17 אולי, משהו כזה, 17 וחצי. הייתי ביריד הספרים, בשבוע הספר, בכיכר מלכי ישראל, מה שהיה אז, מה שהיום הוא כיכר רבין. זה היה זמן קצר לפני שזה הפך להיות כיכר רבין. ובדוכן של עם עובד שלפתי שם ספר מספרי השירה, שמשורר שלא הכרתי, אברהם צוצקבר. פתחתי, התחלתי לקרוא שם ליד הדוכן והתאהבתי. נשוויתי בקסמה של השירה הזאת מיד. ראיתי את זה מתורגם מיידיש. לא נתתי לעצמי שום דין וחשבון, היה לי די ברור למען האמת שמדובר בשורר שנספה בשואה, כי מה אני כבר ידעתי, הייתי נער תל אביבי שבשבילו יידיש זה היה נחלת העבר ושואה, שואה.
Was ich gewähne in 1941, in der Zeit nach Schritte im Ghetto, wenn ich bin gelegen, euch Abäudim behalten und bloß ein Nodellicht dieser Reihe von oben zwischen den Dachelkästen. Und wir gesehen, neben mir liegt ein Teuter Ib. Ich bin heiß, ich bin nackt sein Leib. Und untappen dich mit den Fingern ein Stück der Keul. Und wenn die Nummer schreiben, wie ich Papier ein Lied euch vom Leib von dem Teufel.
אני חושב שיש כאן משהו של פיקוח נפש באופן הזה שבו צוצקובר כותב, ולכן זה אפילו אפשר לכתוב על גופתו של מת, ולא רק אפשר, אלא זה מהותי לשירה הזאת שלו.
One of the things that Sutzkever did was to experience poetry as sanctity. He felt religion through the possibility of creating poetry, which was a higher form of being. So that when he came into the ghetto, what he continued to do was to hold to that higher standard. And what gave him the independence is that the Germans can destroy anything, but nobody can destroy good poetry.
יום אחד הייתי בבית של ההורים שלי, הייתי כבר בן 18 וחצי, משהו כזה. הטלפון מצלצל, אני מרים. ואני שומע מהצד השני קול של איש זקן אומר לי, שלום, אפשר לדבר עם דורי מנור? אני אומר, כן, מי זה בבקשה? והקול אומר לי, הוא מדבר על פרום סוצקבר. ואני זוכר את ההלם של פתאום מגיע קול מן העבר האחר. מישהו שהייתי בטוח שהוא מת. צוצקבר קבע איתי פגישה. כובד הראש הגורלי, ממש גורלי, שבו הוא התייחס לשירה, זה דבר שהמם אותי, לא ראיתי דבר כזה קודם. וזה דבר שאימצתי לעצמי מיד, ברור היה לי שזאת הדרך. שירה זה דבר שמציל חיים.
השירה שלו הצילה את חייו.
Yes, his poetry saved his life. I'd like to read a poem that I dedicated to Sutzkever when he was 90 years old. Should I read it in English, in Hebrew, or both? Yeah. First in English, yes. First in English. The translation is by Ronen Sonis. And there is a motto, an epigraph from one of Sutzkever's poems, one of his diary poems from the 1970s. Deuk bist du, ich derweil dorten. Deuk, not from here, not hereish. You are not hereish. Well, I'm for the while not there-ish. A second talk with Sutzkever. A second talk with Sutzkever. There in the foamy diet's pride, the soul is bathing, practicing a dove-like dive. What is your place of birth? My place of birth, I had to pry it out of the earth with my own hands. It's called the afterlife. I'm having now my second talk with this sandpapered soul. What is your place of birth? Where the volcanic ash is thriving. His eye holds a white granite dove inside its crystal bowl. For 90 years it whitens there, its glance is afterlifely. Our second talk, our umpteenth, all this talking makes us tipsy. Just yesterday we herded in Trakai around the lake, the flying fish that flocked there, and a group of pitch-black gypsies divined within their bowl the darkest wishes that we make. Just yesterday we leaped out from the forest in a phalanx of partisans that gravity would never topple down. And ever since we're gliding over plains in perfect balance, with ever-moving creatures that fly by without a sound. We meet in Tel Aviv at dusk. He's 90, I'm a tremble. To trade all days for younger days and sip our diet Sprite. What is your place of birth? In my next poem. So remember what time did unto thee and write. It's now your turn to write. In this second meeting, Sutzkever told me his biography. We met for the very first time. I was 18, something like that. And he had read some of my poems and translations in the newspaper, and he just contacted me. And then the first time we met, he didn't want to say a single word about himself. He insisted that I tell him about myself. I was a Tel Aviv boy and had no history or biography at all, and I had nothing to say. I could only say that I admired him and admired his poetry, and I was so happy that I had this chance to tell him this and to tell him this truly, because I had already fallen in love with his poetry back then. And only on the second time, on our second meeting at his place in Sharet Street in Tel Aviv, did he tell me about his life for 5 or 6 hours. He began in his childhood in Siberia, and then the war, and the escape from the ghetto after the poisoning of his firstborn son, and the killing of all of his family, or almost, and then his period in the forest with the partisans, and then his unbelievably almost mystical departing from the forest on a small plane with his wife, Freidke, a small plane that was sent to the forest by Stalin himself, because Stalin wanted to use Sutzkever for his propaganda in Moscow. And then Sutzkever in 1946 was the only Jew among in the Nuremberg trials. He was the only Jew, actually, who testified, gave his testimony, and then he arrived to pre-state Israel with his wife Freidke, and he created this great and important Yiddish literary review, the Golden Decade, the Golden Chain. He told me all of this. All this in our second meeting, and I remember that after 2 or 3 hours arrived his daughter. He had 2 daughters that were born in Israel. His daughter Mira, and Mira asked her father gently to tell me a bit about his story, his life story, and he got quite nervous and told her that he had already everything told me, and that if she wants to know where he was born, where he had been born, the answer is העולם הבא. נולדתי בעולם הבא. So that entered immediately the poem. Actually, everything in this poem is authentic. The only thing that I allowed myself to change was that Freydke served us Diet 7-Up and not Diet Sprite. Otherwise, every word is true. Now in Hebrew. גישה שנייה עם סוצקבר. Doik bist du, ich derweil dorten. גישה שנייה עם סוצקבר. בקצף של הדיאט, ספרייט, יונת הנפש, משכשכת את ליבה. היכן נולדת, סוצקבר? אני במו ידיי את מקום הולדתי קריתי. העולם הבא. פגישה שנייה עם נפש עטופה נייר זכוכית. היכן נולדת, סוצקבר? בשקט הוולקני. יונת בזלת מלבינה בעין הבדולחית. 90 שנה היא מלבינה, אך מבטה לא קני. פגישה שנייה? מוטב אולי לומר פגישה נוספת. כי רק אתמול ראינו באגם שבתרקאי דגים מעופפים וצוענים שחורים כזפת. בבדולח ניחשו את החשוך בחשקאי, ורק אתמול ניטרנו מן היער פרטיזנים שכוח הכבידה אינו מספיק להפילם. מאז אנו דועים על המרחב המאוזן עם בריות מחונפות שלא ינוחו לעולם. בערב תל אביבי, בן 90 ובן סחרחורת, יושבים על דיאט ספרייט ומשתכרים מן השיחה. היכן נולדת, סוצקבר? בשיר הבא. זכור את אשר עשה לך הזמן וכתוב. עכשיו תורך. תודה.
Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions or requests for more poems. More poems. Yes.
More poems?
Please. More poems.
Great
in
pleasure.
Hebrew.
In Hebrew? In both languages.
Something from the new book, perhaps? You don't have it?
I only have one poem translated from the new book. I read it. It's a cycle of poems about that's called Trees of Our Land. Atzei Artseinu. Well, it's quite poetic, I guess. And the one that I'm going to read is called Ode to a Pine Tree on the Jerusalem Mountains. And here, once again, there is a motto from Leah Goldberg, from her sonnet Pine. The translation is by Ronen Sonis. Suspended there between the sky and earth, migrating birds may know this pain of mine. Two motherlands, a birth and a rebirth. With you, I've been twice planted, mighty pines, and grew along beside your growing shoots. Within two different landscapes lie my roots. This is Pine by Leah Goldberg, a part of it, and my poem, Ode to a Pine Tree on the Jerusalem Mountains. I hope I'll manage to read it in English. Eshtaol, Tzorah, and Tzova are astonished now to see the tall pine tree brimming over with a virile potency, like old Samson in the story, dying nightly amongst the stone, pillars with immortal glory, waking up again at dawn, stretching needle after needle, thinking morning is obscene. It should rise right from the middle of his treetop evergreen. Then he spreads his wings, a phoenix with a Lithuanian soul, finding out he's stuck between these Tzorah, Tzova, Eshtaol. J and F may not remember, Other trees may find it dull, but the Greeks have called his amber electron. The Jews, chashmal. How they loathe all things aesthetic, every foreign blushing rose. Those who dwell in this prosthetic motherland he blindly chose. Or to put it more precisely, it was forced upon his roots. Now that heat waves seared him nicely, ever since he was a shoot, he wakes up to taste the drying ancient mountains right and left. Oh, the heat waves of dear Zion. Oh, the woods of J&F. Oh, the nights of Lithuania. Who remembers now his past? How a fugitive became a Sabra risen from the dust. Well, almost a Sabra, mind you. For no matter how he tried, thickening his trunk and sinews, he could never cast aside the alveolar thrill prevailing in the clanging of his cones, floating gently in the wailing wind among the naked stones. Oh, proud giant, Zion's golden boy, most masculine of pines. You remember Leah Goldberg, who alluded in her lines to your brothers who were planted and replanted like herself. Can you thrive here falsely rooted, while between the sky and earth, over the prosthetic landscape, two great birds of carrion stand, resting on your heavy shoulders, mourning your two motherlands. And now in Hebrew. לאה גולדברג אולי רק ציפורי מסע יודעות שהן תלויות בין ארץ ושמיים את זה הכאב של שתי המולדות. איתכם אני נשתלתי פעמיים, איתכם אני צמחתי אורנים ושורשיי בשני נופים שונים. That was the motto. אשתאול, צורעה וצובה. משתאות עכשיו שלושתן על העובי והגובה של האורן. הגברתן בעצי היער. גבר בגברים. שכמו שמשון מת עם הפלישתים כל ערב, אך משקים עם אור ראשון, מתמתח מחט מחט, ונחרד לדעת כי החמה אינה זורחת מגופו הענקי, מנופו הענקי. הוא פורס ענף לרוח, פניקס ליטאי גדול, שמצא עצמו תקוע בין צורעה לאשתאול. ונזכר כי ענברו שבתנ"ך קרוי חשמל, שוב אינו עושה כל רושם כאן ביערות קק"ל, כאן בארץ הסולדת מדבר יופי וניכר, כאן בארץ המולדת התותבת שבחר, או נכון יותר כפו על שורשיו הזועקים. כל שרביה כבר צרבוהו, צר לו, שהשכים ומצא עצמו תואם את רגביו של הר קדמון. או הקרן הקיימת, או שרביה של ציון, או לילות הסתיו בליטה, או שלהבת וענבר. מי יזכור עכשיו איך פליט האפר נעשה צבר? או כמעט צבר בעצם. כי ככל שהתעקש ויבא גידים וגזע, לא הצליח לנקש מדינדון נצטרובליו השט ברוח התרשית, זכר לניגון הסלאבי ולריש המכתשית. אורן ירושלמי, גבר בגברים, הרי אתה עוד זוכר את לאה גולדברג, הנשענת בשעתה על אחיך שכמוה נשתלו ונשתלו. איך ניטעת במולדת התותבת, איך נתלו בין הארץ לשמיים. על כתפיך הכבדות שני עופות דורסים לספוד על זכר שתי המולדות.